how much of this is driven by demographics? I remember 30 years ago being in a newsroom and doing stories about what it would be like when the baby boomers reached retirement age, and how there'd be this extraordinary pressure on the healthcare system, and there would be this extraordinary pressure on pensions because people would be all these people would retire at the same time. What is the danger of making so many structural changes for a bubble, and then those young people who come along after that have to live under what structural changes we've made in a crisis? Is that? Am I just being a little bit too esoteric here, or what?
A little bit, but I do think the changes that were made in the pen. I think a lot of people who initially supported or thought they supported the bill that changed the benefits for new hires now realize that it's a very poor pension plan and it needs to be adjusted. I think Ty would even agree with that. So that's why I think when we do make changes, we need to make them carefully. My point, though, was not that I'm saying, well, there's no problem here. It's a huge problem. When you have an $85 billion unfunded liability, that's a huge problem. My point is, and it needs to be addressed, but my point is if we're going to address the problem over the long haul, then we've got to address the whole problem. The basis of the problem was the failure to put in sufficient funds in the past.
But isn't that water under the bridge at this point?
No, because we still have to, what I'm saying, we want to make sure that we put a system in place so that can't happen again. We want a regime like the Municipal Retirement Fund has, where they can ensure that employers, whatever the amount is, whether it's X or Y or Z, whatever the amount we end up needing in order to fund it, that's the amount that's going to be appropriated. In the absence of that, 2 years from now, you can always find something else to spend the money on, which is what they did for the last 40 years in this state. They found something else that they wanted to spend the money on. And that's what they did, and now we have this problem. But now everything is focused on these pensions. Now people say, well, it's because money doesn't go to education. Well, I would say that if you're paying money toward the teacher's pension, that's education money. Maybe that teacher wouldn't teach if they didn't have a pension plan. Maybe they'd go somewhere else and work. So this rhetoric about, well, it's all the pensions, it's all the benefits, which is what most of the rhetoric is. I know Andy mentioned at the beginning the newspapers are now doing a good job of covering it. They're covering the fact that there's a problem, but they're not identifying the problem. And the last place I would look to for information to identify any problem would be the editorial pages of the Tribune. Sometimes the reported page is pretty good, but the editorial page, I wouldn't look there for a solution to any problem.
So can I just put some? I know that, and I couldn't agree more with Henry's last statement about the editorial page of the Chicago Tribune as a place. But here's how, as a policymaker in the state of Illinois, how one of the ways I look at this problem is that we are currently, I think, going to for the next fiscal year, the fiscal year beginning July 1, we're going to put in about $6 billion for the pensions, including the payment of some of the pension debt and the pension notes and the underlying pension and the underlying pension obligation that's been certified by the systems. $6 billion. That's out of a $33 billion general revenue fund. That's already a pretty big number. If we were to just pay the interest on the 80, and I believe that we can. I'm going to take the lowball number of the $80 billion unfunded liability at the 8% interest that TRS 8% interest that TRS is charging on that. That's I'm looking at my math professor out in the audience, Representative Biss, but I believe that's $6.4 billion just to pay the interest on that unfunded liability. Forget the normal cost going forward. That's just to pay the interest. So if we are in the General Assembly are to really pay the full cost of those pensions, we're looking, I'm guessing, somewhere in the $8 to $9 billion range. And how we do that without eating into other obligations that the state has is beyond me. I mean, that we can't do it. And that's on top of the fact that we're already being obliged to cut $2.7 billion out of our Medicaid program. I never thought I'd be happy to be working on the pension issue. I have to say, I would have to argue with Andy's statement that this is the biggest problem facing the state of Illinois. Medicaid is actually the biggest problem facing the state of Illinois right now. But in order of magnitude, but both have to be addressed. Don't get me wrong. So the numbers, and Gina Raimondo from Rhode Island likes to talk about pension math. That's the math right now that we as policymakers are facing, is we can't even pay the interest on the unfunded liability right now.
So I'm just a country boy from Missouri. You're going to help me here. Got to help me with this. So that doesn't that mean that we have to spend less than the $8 billion a year on pensions? We have to spend less. And how do we do that without affecting benefits?
I unfortunately, and it doesn't please me to look people in the eye and say I can't keep the promise that I made to you, but I do feel like that's where we are if we are to make this affordable and to make the system sustainable, which is the goals I think that the pension working group has.
Charles, if I could, because I think it's important for the audience to know this as well. I think that Representative Nekritz's figure is right, of roughly $6 billion that the state is paying for the 5 state-funded pension funds this year. But I think it's important to note that of that $6 billion, $4 billion is for the unfunded liability. The actual cost of covering the pensions that people will earn now, all the teachers in the state are outside of Chicago, all the state employees, all the university employees, it's 1/3 of that amount. So again, the problem is the debt is the debt. We have to pay that off. But the actual cost of the pensions is not what's driving this. It's the unfunded liability which is driving this.
That's generally true. And I don't quarrel with that. Thank you. I don't quarrel with that idea, but the 67% tax increase, people throw that number around. But we all know what the tax increase was, right? That was supposed to go to pay bills down and so forth. Guess what? We still don't have the bills paid. It was a pension borrowing to pay for the pension. So this isn't that the pension, people entitled to pension shouldn't be getting them, but the problem is even larger than has been understood. So it's the couple $1 billion per year for the current normal cost of the pensions. It's the payment down on the unfunded debt. It's to pay the interest on the pension borrowings. Our state is, through all these things, we're kind of rock bottom. We can't worry about bonds very much more because we're only 2 steps from junk status. And if that happens, even though people will buy them now, the reason people will buy our bonds is because Henry's point earlier about some sort of a preference or a guarantee that the pension payments are made. People will still buy Illinois bonds because they're paid first, before pensions, before education, before hospitals, and that gives them worth in the bonding market. It's not very efficient. It's an expensive cost of it. But all I'm trying to suggest to you is we do have to get a hold on Medicaid, on pension. It's going to be drastic. It's going to be tough. It's as difficult as going on in Washington. But if we don't do that, these things will all crumble. And one last point. I'll be the defender of the Tribune here. The people that are writing the articles in the Tribune, they can do what they will, but there are a lot of people that no longer work at that paper because their pension payments weren't made and their bills weren't paid, and they went belly up there on the street. So these people have a particular sensitivity about what has to be done to fix things. Keep that in mind.
What about this? I guess this is a question for either Representative Senger or Nekritz. Has this idea in your work group of transferring pension responsibility to local school districts in the suburbs and downstate, is this getting much traction?
We spent quite a bit of hours discussing the normal cost transfer, along with all the other arithmetic that we're working on to see how we can solve this problem. So my personal opinion on the whole normal cost transfer, it's a good policy to say that the employer who is negotiating your wages should be the one that's setting your pension benefits and the rest. That's a good policy, which doesn't get done now. However, it's not a real solution to what we're trying to do right now, which is to figure out how to make these systems sustainable and pay for that unfunded liability. I have some personal concerns about it going forward. And I was just thinking now, when we set the Constitution in 1970, when we put all the law in, is there anybody now who's even alive? They're all retired, they're all happy that everything was paid for. And I think if they knew...
Except for Speaker Madigan.
Yeah, except for one. Okay. But you're in the retirement mode already. And I believe then, even when these things were done, it was done for the right reasons and the good reasons. And today I had a discussion with Chicago Public School Districts, and we were saying they pick up their normal cost. And what I don't want to see done here, your school boards don't understand how pensions work, so I'm fearful that we're going to land up with some of the same errors we made in the past in the state of Illinois going forward now with our local sets of government. So there's been a lot of discussion on it, but I don't want it, again, it's something that I have a real problem with, making this part of the pension solution.
I would agree with Representative Senger that it has been a subject of a great deal of discussion, and I would disagree a little bit in that I don't think it is the solution. It is a part of the solution. We don't have, unfortunately, one item that's going to solve the whole thing. We're going to have to put together a number of different choose from a menu of options, and several items on that menu. I think that there's a fear that the state is just going to say to the school districts and the universities, here you go. It's all, that whole $1.8 billion that Henry mentioned is the normal cost. Here you go. It's yours. See you. Have a nice life. I don't think anybody really is thinking about doing that. I think we would be phasing this in over a period of years. I would prefer personally that it be over a couple of collective bargaining cycles. I'm not sure that can happen. That can be that long. But I talked offline to a number of school superintendents who say, I think given enough phase-in period, we could absorb those costs.